welcome to everyone. And thank you to Malprogos organization and also Khalsa College for Women for organizing this event. It's a great honor for me to be able to participate in this event and share my thoughts on this occasion of commemoration of the life and works of Professor Gurbhagat Singh. So Professor Gurbhagat Singh was among the most innovative thinkers of the modern Sikh studies field in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. He can be credited with being among the first to bring Western social and linguistic theory to bear upon the field of Sikh studies and to attempt a comparative analysis of Western and Eastern systems of thought. In works such as Western Poetics and Eastern Thought, Transcultural Poetics, he illuminates the encounter of Western and Eastern modes of poetic engagement and shows how such an encounter can shed light on the inner processes of aesthetic realization. In works such as Sikhism and postmodern thought, Kaal Shastra, Dev E Kranti, and Vismadi Punji, he further outlines his theory of cultural mixing and elaborates a theory of what I call here the Sikh semiotic revolution. There have been several writers who have illuminated the experience of Sikhi and the Sikh way of life in prose. Bhai Singh and Professor Puran Singh come to mind as two of our prime exemplars in this field. But to date, no one has attempted to describe the Sikh way of life and ethos from the semiotic perspective. Why this step is so meaningful and critical for us to move forward, to move ahead in the field of Sikh studies, will, I hope, be a little bit more clear by the end of this paper. So in this paper, I want to speak briefly to four different aspects of Professor Gurbhagat Singh's work, in which he outlines his theory of the Sikh semiotic. So the first aspect is the comparison of Western and Eastern models of language, particularly in the area of the relationship between signifiers and signifieds and of symbolism. The second aspect I want to focus on is the Sikh concept of sage. Third concept will be the relationship of mind, body, and language. And finally, I will discuss Professor Gurbhagat Singh's analysis of Sikh semiotics as a liberatory paradigm. So among Professor Gurbhagat Singh's major projects was a comparison of different theories of language, especially between theories of language of the West and of the East. For instance, he writes of the differences between the relationship between the signifier and that which is signified in the West and the East. In the West, during the 20th century, thinking about the signifier-signified relationship has been dominated by the model proposed by Ferdinand Saussure in the early part of the century that states that the relationship between the signifier and signified is an arbitrary one. That is, there's no necessary relationship between the sound and image and the concept that it is associated with. This can be contrasted with various theories of language in the East. For instance, Professor Saib writes about a quite different kind of conceptualization of the signifier-signified relationship in Buddhist language philosophy. He writes that when we speak of the Buddhist concept of shunya, the translation of this term into English as emptiness is not entirely accurate, as emptiness in English connotes nothingness. Rather, the Buddhist concept of shunya refers not to the emptiness in terms of nothingness, but rather emptiness as an absence of movement, as a stillness. Further, this stillness is not the same as death, but rather a kind of balance. At the moment of balance, which is an active state, there is stillness, there are no waves, and this is what we call nirvana. At this moment, when there are no waves, no motion, there is no field upon which distinction can take place. For distinction requires differential of some sort. It requires some movement, some waves. It is at this moment, in the state of nirvana, that the signifier becomes the signified. because distinction of separate objects cannot be made in this state. There can be no distinction between the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the signified. But this is no empty signifier, nor is it arbitrary. The signifier is everything that can be signified. The signified, or that which is signifiable, meaning the entire universe, is the signifier itself. One other example of the comparison between Western and Eastern theories of language that Professor Gurbhagat Singh has done is in the theory of meaning or semantics. The dominant Western models of meaning, particularly from the 20th century onward, have been structural models in which words serve to satisfy some kind of truth condition in the world. That is, one word, one meaning, or range of meanings. So there is no sense of the temporality of meanings, of the unfolding of meaning in time. So meaning is specifiable. It's capable of being limited and quantifiable. It's this model and this concept that has given rise to the genre of the dictionary, which we first see come into existence in Europe in the 18th century. So before this time, we don't see this model at all. We have other forms of lexicon in different parts of the world. For instance, we have Amrakosha in Sanskrit, but not the modern form of the dictionary. So the kinds of meanings that are present in Gurbani, Professor Saab writes, are not those kinds which are quantifiable and presentable in the form of a dictionary. Or we should say, not only those kinds. The meanings of Gurbani are not hidden in the sense of being kept away from sight, but rather it is that they are embedded, they exist in a condensed form that can be unfolded by a perceiver who is open to the potential of the meaning. When I say perceiver here, I mean it can be a reader, a listener, or someone who is engaged in Naam-Simran, who can be both simultaneously a speaker and a listener. The meaning of Gurbani then is not temporally fixed and singular, unlocked at one moment and for all time. In other words, the kind of meaning that can be encoded in a dictionary. But rather, Gurbani is a process, a production of meaning and relevance. It is continual. It is inexhaustible. We can think here of the difference between the dictionary form of meaning and continual, inexhaustible meaning. If a dictionary were to be a collection of continual, inexhaustible meanings, then it could not exist in the finite, closed form of the book. It would have to be a form that changes over time, and of course, being inexhaustible, it would have to be an endless form. To further understand the condensation of meaning, we can think of the meaning of symbolic forms. For instance, think of the meaning of kirpan, karat, and kesh. Are any of these symbols reducible to one single meaning or one single function? In each of them is condensed a multiplicity of ongoing meanings, meanings that exist at the conjuncture of idealism and developing history. So this is the power of thinking semiotically. Thinking semiotically means thinking in terms of an unfolding of a multiplicity of meanings versus thinking structurally, which is thinking in terms of fixed relations of object and meaning in an atemporal space. To say that language contains a multiplicity of meanings is not to say that meaning is completely arbitrary or unmoored. Certainly, meaning is anchored to the potentials of words, phrases, lines, compositions, or an overall orientation of a body of thought. It is not that meaning is fixed, but rather it occurs within a range of possibilities and is sensitive to context. If meaning is fixed, then that means that meaning is static. If it is static, then it means that it is not changing, it is not living. There is a difference, however, between the static state and the state of equilibrium. So this brings me to the next concept I want to discuss, which is Professor Gurbhagat Singh's concept of Saj. So in the same way that shunya is not emptiness precisely, the state of Saj is not a static state. Rather, as Professor Saab has written, the state of Saj is a state of cosmic equilibrium. To be in a state of cosmic equilibrium means to be in balance. But that balance is a conscious activity. It's an activity that involves active awareness, and so cosmic equilibrium involves a total awareness of all activities that are occurring at any given moment. To be in a state of Sag then requires that the practitioner, far from embodying a kind of passive resignation, be completely active and aware. The state of Sag is an acknowledgement. It is a taking into account of the universe. It is the achievement of balance, a balance of the spirit, a balance between self and other, and a balance between self and nature. It is in this state that it is a state that is achieved not through passivity, but through action. A kind of actionless action, perhaps, but one that requires an aware consciousness of all that exists. The contrast of the model of Sag as a state of active balance and structuralism as a state of static, fixed meaning is something we should think through in relation to our own way of living today. For instance, which of these models has the Sikh Panth adopted for itself today? Which models is it living through? Is it the closed world of the ahistorical, unchangeable structure, or is it the model of Sag, of continual development, of self-understanding, and the understanding of nature and our place within it? That is to say, is it a rational and mathematical differential, a model that finds meaning in its own internal structures, or is it the model of cosmic equilibrium, an open model of continuity, one that engages with time, looking outward and looking forward? Are we living in a mode of production that is in tune with the semiotic potential of Gurbani? How does the state of Sag articulate with the capitalist or neoliberal model of production? How does it promote or engender the state of Sag, or does it create imbalance? To be in a state of Sag is to acknowledge, to understand, and to harmonize that which is unbalanced. It means active engagement. I should hopefully be becoming more clear. Though these might be considered academic debates in a sense, in actuality, as Professor Saab reminds us, they are not solely academic in their scope. The semiotic potential of Gurbani informs our lives from the seemingly most mundane material aspects to the deepest recesses of our psyche. In fact, the material and psychological aspects of our lives are intimately connected. It is to this connection between the mind, body, and language that I want to turn our attention next. As Professor Gurbhagat writes, the concept of Naam is as much libidinal as it is rational. So what does he mean here when he says that Naam is libidinal and rational? In part, he is answering to the Cartesian model of dualism, of which the most famous example is the well-known formula, I think, therefore I am. Perhaps we subscribe to this formula because of its elegant simplicity. It seems to reduce an unimaginably complex phenomenon, the phenomenon of being, to a simple and elegant formula, much like Einstein's formula, E equals mc squared. But the formula, I think, therefore I am, is a false formula. It has been false for centuries. It is false in the sense that it does not hold up to empirical verification, or the scientific method of which it is itself the root. In fact, the formula is itself a product of its own ideology. It's a product of abstract thought without the verification of bodily experience. Rather, a more accurate formula might be something more along the lines of I think, I feel, I experience, therefore I am. Professor Gurbhagat Singh writes about the concept of what he calls semio-phenomenology. In this model, language is not a conceptual system, a carrier for abstract ideas. Rather, language is connected, as Professor Saad writes, to the luminous Buddha body. Language is always a bodily phenomenon. Just as surely as I'm speaking to you here, using the physical apparatus to produce my voice, or you you are using your physical apparatus to register these sounds, will we write in the pages of a notebook or read the same, there is a materiality to language that is integral to language. Language only exists so far as it is material, and without that materiality, it is non-existent. This idea is completely contrary to the Saussurian model of langue and parole, with langue as an abstract system and parole as actual speech. So in this way, Professor Gurbhagat Singh is critiquing the dominant Saussurian model of language. In the same vein, Professor Gurbhagat Singh mentions a commentary on Brahma Sutra by Shankara that states that man is only a body that is qualified by consciousness. This is essentially a reversal of the Cartesian formula I just mentioned before. I think, therefore I am. But the interesting thing here is that the mind and body, the interesting thing here is how in both of these formulations, the dual mind-body split remains presupposed. That is, the idea that the mind and body are different things or represent different orders of reality informs both theories. In both models, we see the familiar base and superstructure. That is, first, either we are primarily a body infused with the capacity for thought, or the reverse. We are primarily thinking entities that happen to take form in physical bodies. Why must it be one or the other? Largely, that's a function of the extent of the array of choices that are presented to us. This array of choices is represented to us as the full extent of reality. So we accept the presented array of choices as the full extent of reality because we are conditioned to think in terms of binary categories such as black and white, day and night, up and down, inside and outside, and so on. The answer then to the question of what our primary identity is must be either this or that, either mind or body, one or the other. What Professor Gurbhagat Singh Ji suggests is, when he writes of the sixth semiotic, is that in the sixth semiotic, these presuppositions are not the only possibilities. Reality is not subdivided into these categories on its own. Nature has not divided itself into mind and body. It is only in our minds that things are conceptualized in this way. Thus, Professor Saab outlines what is in essence a holistic approach, what we might call a mind-body approach that has been described by the gurus in Sri Guru Granth Sahib. Note that in English, there is no single unified term for the mind-body complex as a whole. We must use the two opposing terms, mind and body, in a compound term, mind-body. To render the term mind-body as a unified term, we have to counter our intuition, which tells us that the mind and body are in fact separate entities. So as you can see, the process of rendering a concept that our intuitive mental structures tells us is a binary one into a single category is much more difficult than it appears. Even when we think we are transcending our deep-seated categories, they show themselves again and again in various forms. This is what Professor Gurbhagat Singh is referring to when he writes that, quote, to experience this notion of unification means to the gurus to decondition oneself and to de-subject oneself from the ideology of the ruling imperial class, unquote. Or we can add here, of the dominant hegemonic structure. The Sikh gurus were well aware of these conceptual dilemmas and how deeply these categories are rooted in our mental structures. Professor Saab writes further that, quote, the counter-ideology that the gurus evolved over several generations centered around semiotic change. The sixth semiotic system thus reorders the universe by creating new relationships and shifting the underlying presumptions about reality that we have come to hold, not necessarily on the basis of experience, but through cultural pattern. I'll just repeat that last line. The sixth semiotic system thus reorders the universe by creating new relationships and shifting the underlying assumptions about reality that we have come to hold, not on the basis of our own experience, but through cultural patterning. As Professor Gurbhagat Singh writes, there is a usefulness in thinking through and applying outside critical models to our own phenomena, such as examining Gurbani. The famous German writer Goethe once said that one cannot ever truly know one's own language until one learns another language. In this way, learning the new language of a critical apparatus enables us to see our own indigenous language more clearly. As Professor G writes, we need to learn the Western categories thoroughly in order to solve the problems that those categories have created. Those problems cannot be solved by the rejection of the categories. This is tantamount to a rejection of the world, which runs counter to Sikh philosophy. Professor G writes, this runs counter to Sikh philosophy, Professor G writes, which calls for an embrace of the world in all its multiplicity. We need to know that the categories and the intellectual trajectory they develop from in order to effectively engage with the world that has been created on their basis, and then to solve the problems that those categories have created. At the same time, as Professor Saab writes, we should not apply these models uncritically as an end in themselves. We need to be able to critique them and understand their limitations. For instance, in the case just mentioned, applying a dualistic model to a phenomenon that is essentially non-dualistic. Professor G also writes that it is vital to develop our own indigenous critical models, models that are sensitive to the context in which meanings, for instance, of Gurbani, can be unfolded most fully. At the same time as we use models, we need to develop the faculty of questioning the models that have been imposed upon us, or that we, knowingly or unknowingly, have imposed upon others or upon ourselves. Professor Gurbhagat Singh writes that Punjabi culture has singularized itself. There is no longer any basis for exchange, for dialogue, for comparison. This has led to an intellectual impoverishment, an inability to realize the potentials and full meaning of our own literature. It is this lack to which Professor Gurbhagat Singh Ji is responding when he proposes and uses the comparative model of analysis. It is a comparative model that brings about conversation and dialogue. It is a comparative model alone that brings about introspection, self-knowledge, and Atam Gyan. So bringing us to the conclusion, it is this Atam Gyan that gives birth to the liberative paradigm, and it is to this paradigm that I'll like to turn our attention next. As Professor G writes, the emphasis in Sri Guru Granth Sahib is on de-othering the other, that is, embracing the other and making it one's own. Again, this is a move away from the dualistic notions towards a totality of experience. It is not the erasure of cultural differences, according to Professor G, but rather the embrace of real diversity of the world, the real diversity of the world. In a way, Sri Guru Granth Sahib must always take a contrary position, as Professor G notes, for the rights of the perceived other cannot be perceived from within the hegemonic system itself. He writes further that Sri Guru Granth Sahib attacks the master systems of philosophy that both prepare people to accept their situation as necessary and unchangeable, and at the same time perpetuate systems of marginalization. This inclusive embrace of totality is not an ordinary political kind of totalizing, a totalizing based upon fear and a desire to control, but rather it is a totality that is connected through pyar and love. It is not a vertical approach, but a horizontal approach. It's not a top-down condemnation and judgment, but an adjacent seeking, a searching out, a curiosity, a desire to know and embrace that which is not known. Mystery. In this process, what were previously objects of knowledge and control become subjects, rather, of understanding and dialogue. Silenced and erased subjects are given their voice back. The dam built by the controlling and negative impulse is broken, and the river begins to flow once more. Professor Gurbhagat Singh writes that the Sadh Sangat is not separate from other political structures. In other words, it's not simply an institution that exists under the kind and watchful benevolence of larger, more authoritative political structures. Love, liberation, and inclusivity are the potential structures that we wish to embody, and by embodying them, we institute them. Thus, the Sadh Sangat must become the political structure. So I've spoken here quite a bit about models, concepts, and ideologies. So lastly, I want to turn our attention to a concrete example of the manifestation of the liberatory paradigm within Sikhi that Professor Gurbhagat Singh has outlined. So I ask here, have you really realized the revolutionary potential of the concept of langar? On one level, langar is the communal preparation and serving of food, taken together by everyone equally. Many people, when they come from abroad, from Canada, England, Australia, and so on and so forth, come and visit Harmandir Sahib. They produce documentaries about langar at Harmandir Sahib. In those documentaries, it's mentioned how much sangat is served every day, so many tens of thousands of persons. So many kilograms of dal are cooked every day. So many kilograms of atta are cooked every day, and so on and so forth. These are the facts of the matter. They are true facts. But there's a difference between the facts of the matter and the liberatory truth of the matter. What does it mean when everyone's basic needs for sustenance are being met? This situation, first, it's a decidedly non-capitalistic model, with work shared for the benefit of all, without the thought of monetary profit for any individual. Second, this institution, where the basic physical needs for sustenance are being met, allows for the opportunity for the Sangat to fully partake in the experience of Shabad. In other words, to move from the material concerns to spiritual concerns. But when we do partake in langar, do we think of this as a total liberatory paradigm to free ourselves from the oppressive and hegemonic political structures? The total liberatory paradigm embraces all levels of liberation. It begins with the material, yes, but that's not the end of liberation. That is only the beginning, according to Professor Sahib. According to Sikh thought, for full liberation, change must occur at all levels. So do we think of langar as an institution of convenience for us, or do we think of it as an institution for liberatory potential? After we take langar, do we think of this as the liberatory institution that was gifted to us by the Sikh gurus, or do we just go on with the rest of our day? As Professor Sahib has written, we only accept the divisive and dualistic model of othering structures because we have been conditioned to do so. And finally, in conclusion, in his book, Sikhism and Postmodern Thought, Professor Gurbhagat Singh writes that the Sikh mind, quote, the Sikh mind has liberated itself from the grand narrative. So reading this gave me pause. His argument that the Sikh semiotic has the potential for restructuring our spiritual and political approaches that I've briefly outlined here today certainly seems convincing. But I had questions as to whether the Sikh Sangat, as the inheritors of the Sikh way of life bestowed upon us by the Gurus, has in fact lived up to its promise and potential. In what ways are we living cultural patterns that really differ in any significant way from mainstream societies, not just here in Punjab or in India, but in global communities where Sikhs have settled over the last century? Is the Sikh Sangat really able to present a viable alternative to the hegemonic structures and categories of global capitalism? Or are they, while nominally different in outward form, following the same dominant cultural patterns? So I would suggest that it will take some careful soul searching and introspection to really think about whether or not we are really, in fact, transcending those structures that are conditioning our thoughts and categories. Professor Gurbhagat Singh has given us some tools to begin this introspection in thought. Only then will we be able to live up to the promise that Gurbhagat Singh Ji has so eloquently given us when he writes, quote, an authentic Sikh saturated with a Sikh semiotic can only be a no-nonsense revolutionary whose being is filled with beauty in this field. But to date, no one has attempted to describe the Sikh way of life and ethos from the semiotic perspective. Why this step is so meaningful and critical for us to move forward, to move ahead in the field of Sikh studies, will, I hope, be a little bit more clear by the end of this paper. So in this paper, I want to speak briefly to 4 different aspects of Professor Gurbhagat Singh Ji's work. in which he outlines his theory of the Sikh semiotic. So the first aspect is the comparison. Welcome to everyone, and thank you to Not4Gas organization and also Khalsa College for Women for organizing this event. It's a great honor for me to be able to participate in this event and share my thoughts on this occasion of commemoration of the life and works of Professor Gurbhagat Singh. So Professor Gurbhagat Singh was among the most innovative thinkers of the modern Sikh studies field in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, of Western and Eastern models of language, particularly in the area of the relationship between signifiers and signifieds and of symbolism. The second aspect I want to focus on is the Sikh concept of Sahaj. Third concept will be the relationship of mind, body, and language. And finally, I will discuss Professor Gurbhagat Singh's analysis of Sikh semiotics as a liberatory paradigm realization. In works such as Sikhism and postmodern thought, Kav Shastra, Dev Kranti, and Vismadi Punji, he further outlines his theory of cultural mixing and elaborates a theory of what I call here the Sikh semiotic revolution. There have been several writers who have illuminated the experience of Sikhi and the Sikh way of life in prose. Bhagir Singh and Professor Puninder Singh come to mind as two of our prime exemplars. He can be credited with being among the first to bring Western social and linguistic theory to bear upon the field of Sikh studies and to attempt a comparative analysis of Western and Eastern systems of thought. In works such as Western Poetics and Eastern Thought, Transcultural Poetics, he illuminates the encounter of Western and Eastern modes of poetic engagement and shows how such an encounter can shed light on the inner processes of aesthetic